Charlotte International Airport was bustling that summer morning. The check-in lines snaked through the main area, and the hum of conversations and announcements echoed through the terminal. Lydia Harper, a 39-year-old black woman, stood in the boarding line, holding her bag in one hand and her phone in the other, confirming the details of her medical conference in New York. Lydia was a respected physician, known for her work in underserved communities where she provided free care to those who couldn't afford it. Despite all the recognition, Lydia's life had never been easy. As a black woman, she had faced racism at various stages of her life, but it had only made her more determined to fight for justice. As she boarded Flight 237 to New York, Lydia smiled politely at the flight attendant and made her way to her seat in economy class. She placed her bag in the overhead compartment and sat down, looking forward to a smooth flight to the conference the next day. Minutes later, a middle-aged white man with gray hair and an expensive suit approached her seat. He looked at the number on his ticket and then at Lydia with a clear expression of displeasure. "Excuse me," he said, trying to hide his annoyance. "That's my seat." Lydia smiled, slightly confused. "Oh, of course, I'm sorry." She stood up so the man could take the window seat, which he did with an exaggerated sigh of exasperation. Lydia resumed her seat next to him, trying to ignore the discomfort she felt. The man settled in but continued to cast furtive, irritated glances in her direction. Lydia decided to let it go. The flight would be short, and they would soon be in New York. However, as the plane prepared for takeoff, Lydia noticed that the man next to her, John Parker, was growing increasingly agitated. He fidgeted in his seat, sighed, and muttered something under his breath. Once the plane took off, the tension in the air seemed to rise. John Parker finally spoke, but his words were far from polite. "These airlines are getting worse and worse," he grumbled, not looking directly at Lydia. "Now anyone can sit wherever they want. There's no more respect, is there?" Lydia, trying to stay calm, responded gently. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't quite catch what you meant." John then turned to her, his face hardened. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice full of disdain. "People like you should know your place." Lydia felt a chill run down her spine. She had been through similar situations before, but she hadn't expected something so direct in such a public setting. She took a deep breath, trying to maintain her composure. "Sir, I'm just trying to get to my destination, just like you. I don't see why we need to have this kind of conversation." John huffed again, turning to the window and muttering words that Lydia could barely hear. But the tone was clear. He didn't want her there. Behind them, in the row immediately behind, Derek Williams watched the interaction in silence. He didn't know Lydia, but he was familiar with men like John Parker. Derek, a 44-year-old Army veteran and civil rights activist, knew that it was necessary to act carefully in such situations, but he also knew that silence was often seen as complicity. He decided to wait for the right moment to intervene, knowing that dealing with people like John required more than just words. Lydia, for her part, tried to focus on the work she had ahead, but John's words echoed in her mind, bringing up memories of other times she had been treated as inferior. She knew she needed to stay strong, but at that moment, she wished more than anything for the flight to be over. The journey that had started so promisingly was turning into a test of patience, and Lydia wondered how much longer she could endure John's disdain. Meanwhile, Derek, behind them, prepared to act, knowing that something needed to be done before the situation got any worse. The plane had reached cruising altitude, and passengers began to settle in. The sound of the engines was a constant hum in the background, and the lights indicated that it was safe to unfasten seatbelts. Lydia Harper, trying to keep her mind off the discomfort beside her, opened a medical book she had brought in her carry-on, hoping to focus on reading. John Parker, however, didn't seem willing to leave Lydia alone. He looked at her with growing irritation, as if her mere presence was a personal affront. Lydia tried to ignore it, but the tension was palpable. "You must be one of those who thinks you can sit anywhere just because things have changed, right?" John said, his voice low but laden with contempt. "These changes don't mean you belong in places like this." Lydia closed the book slowly, maintaining her calm as she looked at him. "Sir, I don't know why you're treating me this way, but I have every right to be here, just like any other passenger." John let out a sarcastic laugh, shaking his head. Right? What right do you have to be here, in the same space as me? People like you shouldn't even be allowed to travel on flights like this, let alone sit next to decent people. Lydia felt her heart race, but she refused to give in to fear or anger. She had faced racism before, but John's cruelty was beyond what she had expected to encounter. Lydia knew she needed to stay strong, but the situation was becoming increasingly unbearable. Look, Lydia said, keeping her voice calm but firm. I'm not here to cause any trouble. I'm just trying to get to my destination, like any other passenger. If you have a problem with me, I suggest you speak to the crew and see what they can do. John looked at her, surprised by the firm response, but soon his face twisted in disdain. The crew? You think they'll care? They probably put you here just to fill some ridiculous quota. Now, I'm stuck with you next to me for the whole flight. This is absurd. Lydia took a deep breath, maintaining her composure, but she knew the situation was out of her hands. Looking ahead, she noticed a flight attendant passing by and discreetly waved to catch her attention. Is there a problem here, gentlemen? Asked the flight attendant, approaching with a smile but a sharp gaze. John was quick to respond before Lydia could say anything. Yes, there is a problem. I've been seated next to this woman, and I don't think it's appropriate. I pay a lot for these flights, and I wasn't expecting to deal with this. The flight attendant looked at Lydia, who was visibly uncomfortable, and then at John, recognizing the discriminatory tone in his words. Sir, all passengers have the right to be here, regardless of who they are. If there is anything we can do to improve your flight experience, we will do our best. However, we cannot and will not move someone from their seat for this reason. Lydia silently thanked the flight attendant with a slight nod, but John was not satisfied. So, that's how it is? You're siding with her? He raised his voice, drawing the attention of other passengers. Before the situation could escalate further, Derek Williams, who was sitting behind John, decided it was time to intervene. He leaned forward and spoke calmly but with authority. Excuse me, sir. I think you should calm down. It's clear that the crew has addressed your complaint. I would suggest you accept the response and move on. John turned abruptly, surprised by the intervention. He looked at Derek, noticing his presence for the first time, and his expression shifted from irritation to challenge. And who are you to tell me what to do? John asked, his voice dripping with disdain. Derek met his gaze firmly, not backing down. I'm just a passenger who wants a smooth flight, like everyone else here. And I believe the lady next to you deserves respect, just like any other human being. If you have issues with that, maybe you need to reflect on your attitudes. The flight attendant looked at Derek with gratitude and turned back to John. Sir, please calm down. Any disruptive behavior could result in action from the crew. Everyone here wants a peaceful flight. John, realizing he had no allies in this situation, huffed and turned to the window, refusing to say anything more. Lydia felt a momentary relief, but she knew the tension was still there, hanging in the air. Derek, on the other hand, settled back in his seat, keeping a watchful eye on John, prepared to act again if necessary. The plane continued its journey to New York, but for Lydia, the flight had already turned into something far different from what she had anticipated. Beside her, John's heavy silence was just a pause, and she knew more was yet to come. Meanwhile, Derek was ready for whatever came next, determined to ensure that justice was served, no matter what happened. The flight proceeded, but the tension between John Parker and Lydia Harper was palpable. John continued to look at Lydia with contempt, clearly disturbed by her presence next to him. The atmosphere, once merely uncomfortable, was now charged with a heavy energy that everyone around could feel. Derek Williams, the passenger sitting right behind John, watched everything closely. He knew that John's behavior couldn't continue without consequences, but he also understood that confronting someone like John required a careful approach. He had faced similar situations during his time in the Army and as a civil rights activist, but each situation was unique and needed to be handled with discernment. After a few minutes, when John began to murmur insults again, Derek decided he couldn't wait any longer. He leaned forward and gently tapped John's shoulder to get his attention. "Excuse me, sir," Derek said, his voice calm but firm. John turned abruptly, his gaze full of irritation. "What do you want now?" he asked, clearly annoyed at being interrupted. Derek remained calm and looked directly into John's eyes. "I think you should reconsider how you're treating the lady next to you," Derek said. "We're all on this flight for one reason or another, and there's no reason for anyone to make the journey harder for others." John narrowed his eyes, surprised by the unexpected intervention. "And who do you think you are to tell me what to do?" John retorted, his tone challenging. "She has nothing to do with this. It's a matter of principles. People like her." "People like her?" Derek interrupted, his tone growing more assertive. "You're talking about a person just like anyone else, someone who deserves respect. If you think you can speak to her like that just because you're sitting next to her, you're very mistaken." Lydia, who had been trying to stay calm, couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and admiration for Derek's intervention. She looked at him, grateful but also concerned about the escalating situation. "Sir, I really appreciate it, but," Lydia started to say, but was interrupted by Derek. "Don't worry, ma'am," Derek said, keeping his eyes on John. "I won't allow him to keep this up." John scoffed, shaking his head. "Do you think you're being a hero?" he said, with sarcasm in his voice. "This is ridiculous. People like him need to learn their place. I'm tired of dealing with this, and I won't stay silent." Derek felt a surge of indignation but kept his composure. He knew losing his temper would only make things worse. "We all have our place, sir, and everyone's place is where they choose to be," Derek said firmly. "This flight is for everyone, regardless of color, background, or anything else. You need to understand that the world has changed, and it's time for you to change too." John looked at him with disdain, but something in Derek's stance made him hesitate. Perhaps it was Derek's confidence or the fact that other passengers were starting to pay attention, but John realized he was losing control of the situation. Lydia looked at Derek with a mix of gratitude and worry. She knew he was risking something by intervening, especially given John's reaction, but at the same time, she felt strengthened by not being alone in this confrontation. "I suggest you calm down and think about what you're doing," Derek continued. "This flight will continue, with or without your cooperation. And if you can't show respect, maybe you need to consider the consequences." John opened his mouth to retort, but the flight attendant, who had been watching the situation closely, approached again. "Sir, we need all passengers to cooperate for a smooth flight," she said, looking directly at John. "If this continues, we'll have to take more serious measures. Please follow the guidelines and respect your fellow passengers." John seemed on the verge of exploding but held back. He glared at Derek with suppressed anger, then turned to Lydia, who watched him with a calm and resolute gaze. "This isn't over," John muttered, finally turning to face the window, ending the confrontation. Derek watched for a moment, ensuring that John had truly given up before leaning back in his seat. Lydia glanced at him, exchanging a silent understanding. She gave a slight smile, and Derek returned the gesture with a nod. The tension still hung in the air, but the confrontation seemed to have reached a pause. The other passengers, who had remained silent, resumed their activities, but the atmosphere on the plane was far from normal. Everyone knew that the incident had left a mark, and many wondered what might happen next. Lydia reopened her book, now with a renewed determination. She knew that this flight would be remembered for a long time, not just by her, but by everyone who had witnessed what had happened. And although the tension hadn't disappeared completely, she felt more secure knowing that someone was willing to stand up alongside her. The plane continued its route to New York, but the atmosphere on board had changed drastically. People could feel the discomfort in the air, even those seated farther from the scene of the incident. Whispers spread through the aisles as passengers exchanged worried glances, but no one dared to speak directly. The tense silence was almost as oppressive as John's insults had been moments before. Lydia Harper, still seated next to John Parker, was visibly uncomfortable but remained resolute. Derek Williams, who had intervened on her behalf, continued to stay vigilant, watching for any movement or words from John. The flight crew tried to carry on with their routines, but it was clear that everyone was aware of the situation. John, for his part, was restless. He stared out the window with clenched jaws, unable to accept that his attitude had not intimidated Lydia, Derek, or the other passengers. His frustration only grew, and he fidgeted with his leg, demonstrating his increasing irritation. "I don't know why everyone's acting like I'm the problem here," John muttered, loud enough for Derek and Lydia to hear. Derek, hearing the comment, decided to maintain his calm but firm stance. You still don't get it, do you? Derek said, leaning forward, speaking in a measured tone. The problem isn't just what you said, but what it represents. What you're doing here is much bigger than a simple argument on a flight. Lydia glanced sideways at Derek, feeling the weight of his words. She knew he was right. John's expressed racism was merely a reflection of something much deeper and systemic. John let out a dry, sarcastic laugh without turning around. Oh, please, spare me the moralizing talk. You people always do this, he said, his voice laden with bitterness. Always playing the victim. There's always an excuse, isn't there? That's why this country is the way it is. Derek kept his tone calm, though it was clear he was also irritated by John's words. Do you think we're pretending? Derek asked. Do you think people like Lydia or me choose to go through this? No rational person would choose to face prejudice every day. But that's what you seem to fail to understand. Lydia, who had been quiet until then, leaned slightly forward, deciding it was time to speak for herself. You know, Mr. Parker, she said, using the name she had heard from one of the flight attendants. You're sitting here, talking about what you think you know about me and people like me. But you've never lived my reality. You've never had to constantly prove your worth or fight for respect that should be everyone's right. John finally turned to face her, his eyes narrowing with resentment. I know exactly what I'm talking about, he replied, his voice dropping lower but still venomous. You people always want more, always demanding more. Nothing is ever enough. Lydia took a deep breath, struggling not to let her anger surface. What we want, Mr. Parker, is simply to be treated like human beings, she said, her voice firm but controlled. We're not asking for anything more than the respect and dignity that every person should have. And if that seems too much for you, then maybe the problem lies with your limited view of what respect means. Lydia's response hit John in an unexpected way. He fell silent for a moment, processing her words. The passion in her voice, combined with her calm demeanor, seemed to affect him in a way that previous remarks hadn't. At that moment, the flight attendant approached again, noticing that the situation hadn't improved much since the last time. Is everything all right here? She asked, with a firm but concerned tone. Before John could respond, Derek spoke up. The situation is under control, for now, Derek said, keeping his eyes on John. But it would be wise to make sure he understands the potential consequences if this continues. The flight attendant looked at John with seriousness, not hiding the implied warning. Mr. Parker, she said, this flight needs to continue in safety and peace. If there are further disruptive behaviors, we won't hesitate to take more serious measures, such as informing the authorities upon landing. John snorted, clearly irritated, but seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. He looked at the flight attendant, then at Lydia, and finally at Derek, before muttering something inaudible and turning back to the window. The flight attendant cast one last glance at Lydia and Derek, as if offering a silent apology, before walking away. Derek leaned back in his seat again, feeling that the situation had been, at least temporarily, contained. Lydia looked at him and gave a slight smile of thanks. Thank you, really, she said softly. No problem, Derek replied. No one should have to go through this alone. And so, the flight continued, but the weight of the tension in the air remained, making it clear that this story was far from over. As the plane continued its journey to New York, the tension among the passengers persisted. The uncomfortable silence was broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional whispers among the passengers. Derek Williams, however, remained calm, but recent events reminded him of his own past. A past that had shaped who he was and why he stood firmly against injustice. Derek leaned back in his seat, letting his mind wander to distant times. Flashbacks from his youth began to surface. He had grown up in a small town in Alabama where racism was part of daily life. At school, he was constantly bullied by white boys, but it was there that he learned the importance of standing up against oppression. Flashback asterisk. Derek, at 14, was walking home from school. He carried his books tightly against his chest, his gaze fixed ahead, ignoring the whispers and malicious glances from his classmates. 3 white boys followed him, laughing and making racist jokes. They cornered him in an alley. "Hey, Derek, where do you think you're going?" One of the boys taunted, with a mocking grin. Derek took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, but anger bubbled inside him. He knew that if he reacted violently, it would be him facing the consequences, not the bullies. "I just want to go home," Derek replied, keeping his voice steady. The boys laughed. "You think you can walk around here like you're one of us?" Another boy said, shoving Derek against the wall. Derek stood his ground, his eyes meeting those of the bullies. "I don't need to be like you. I just want to be treated with respect, like anyone else." The response surprised the boys, who had expected a different reaction. But before they could continue, an older man, Derek's father, appeared at the entrance of the alley. His presence intimidated the boys, who quickly fled. "Are you okay, son?" Derek's father asked, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. Derek nodded, but the resolve in his eyes had already been forged in that moment. He knew that from that day forward, he would fight against injustice whenever he encountered it, no matter the consequences. Lydia Harper, still seated next to John Parker, was visibly uncomfortable but remained resolute. Derek Williams, who had intervened on her behalf, continued to stay vigilant, watching for any movement or words from John. The flight crew tried to carry on with their routines, but it was clear that everyone was aware of the situation. John, for his part, was restless. He stared out the window with clenched jaws, unable to accept that his attitude had not intimidated Lydia, Derek, or the other passengers. His frustration only grew, and he fidgeted with his leg, demonstrating his increasing irritation. "I don't know why everyone's acting like I'm the problem here," John muttered, loud enough for Derek and Lydia to hear. Derek, hearing the comment, decided to maintain his calm but firm stance. "You still don't get it, do you?" Derek said, leaning forward, speaking in a measured tone. "The problem isn't just what you said, but what it represents. What you're doing here is much bigger than a simple argument on a flight." Lydia glanced sideways at Derek, feeling the weight of his words. She knew he was right. John's expressed racism was merely a reflection of something much deeper and systemic. John let out a dry, sarcastic laugh without turning around. "Oh, please, spare me the moralizing talk. You people always do this," he said, his voice laden with bitterness. "Always playing the victim. There's always an excuse, isn't there? That's why this country is the way it is." Derek kept his tone calm, though it was clear he was also irritated by John's words. "Do you think we're pretending?" Derek asked. "Do you think people like Lydia or me choose to go through this? No rational person would choose to face prejudice every day. But that's what you seem to fail to understand." Lydia, who had been quiet until then, leaned slightly forward, deciding it was time to speak for herself. "You know, Mr. Parker," she said, using the name she had heard from one of the flight attendants, "you're sitting here, talking about what you think you know about me and people like me. But you've never lived my reality. You've never had to constantly prove your worth or fight for respect that should be everyone's right." John finally turned to face her, his eyes narrowing with resentment. "I know exactly what I'm talking about," he replied, his voice dropping lower but still venomous. "You people always want more, always demanding more. Nothing is ever enough." Lydia took a deep breath, struggling not to let her anger surface. "What we want, Mr. Parker, is simply to be treated like human beings," she said, her voice firm but controlled. "We're not asking for anything more than the respect and dignity that every person should have. And if that seems too much for you, then maybe the problem lies with your limited view of what respect means." Lydia's response hit John in an unexpected way. He fell silent for a moment, processing her words. The passion in her voice, combined with her calm demeanor, seemed to affect him in a way that previous remarks hadn't. At that moment, the flight attendant approached again, noticing that the situation hadn't improved much since the last time. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, with a firm but concerned tone. Before John could respond, Derek spoke up. "The situation is under control, for now," Derek said, keeping his eyes on John. "But it would be wise to make sure he understands the potential consequences if this continues." The flight attendant looked at John with seriousness, not hiding the implied warning. "Mr. Parker," she said, "this flight needs to continue in safety and peace. If there are further disruptive behaviors, we won't hesitate to take more serious measures, such as informing the authorities upon landing. John snorted, clearly irritated, but seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. He looked at the flight attendant, then at Lydia, and finally at Derek, before muttering something inaudible and turning back to the window. The flight attendant cast one last glance at Lydia and Derek, as if offering a silent apology, before walking away. Derek leaned back in his seat again, feeling that the situation had been, at least temporarily, contained. Lydia looked at him and gave a slight smile of thanks. "Thank you, really," she said softly. "No problem," Derek replied. "No one should have to go through this alone." And so, the flight continued, but the weight of the tension in the air remained, making it clear that this story was far from over. As the plane continued its journey to New York, the tension among the passengers persisted. The uncomfortable silence was broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional whispers among the passengers. Derek Williams, however, remained calm, but recent events reminded him of his own past. A past that had shaped who he was and why he stood firmly against injustice. Derek leaned back in his seat, letting his mind wander to distant times. Flashbacks from his youth began to surface. He had grown up in a small town in Alabama where racism was part of daily life. At school, he was constantly bullied by white boys, but it was there that he learned the importance of standing up against oppression. Flashback asterisk. Derek, at 14, was walking home from school. He carried his books tightly against his chest, his gaze fixed ahead, ignoring the whispers and malicious glances from his classmates. 3 white boys followed him, laughing and making racist jokes. They cornered him in an alley. "Hey, Derek, where do you think you're going?" one of the boys taunted, with a mocking grin. Derek took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, but anger bubbled inside him. He knew that if he reacted violently, it would be him facing the consequences, not the bullies. "I just want to go home," Derek replied, keeping his voice steady. The boys laughed. "You think you can walk around here like you're one of us?" Another boy said, shoving Derek against the wall. Derek stood his ground, his eyes meeting those of the bullies. "I don't need to be like you. I just want to be treated with respect, like anyone else." The response surprised the boys, who had expected a different reaction. But before they could continue, an older man, Derek's father, appeared at the entrance of the alley. His presence intimidated the boys, who quickly fled. "Are you okay, son?" Derek's father asked, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. Derek nodded, but the resolve in his eyes had already been forged in that moment. He knew that from that day forward, he would fight against injustice whenever he encountered it, no matter the consequences. Lydia, sensing that Derek was lost in thought, turned to him. "You seem distant," she commented softly, pulling Derek back to the present. Derek smiled faintly, his gaze filled with determination. "I was just thinking about how life is full of battles we never choose, but we have to face them anyway." Lydia nodded, understanding the weight behind Derek's words. "I imagine you've faced many of those battles," she said. Derek looked ahead, his eyes fixed on an invisible point. "More than I'd like to remember," he replied, "but each one taught me something. And one thing I've learned is that we can't let fear or ignorance stop us from fighting for what's right." Lydia felt a shiver run down her spine. Derek's strength and conviction were palpable, and she knew that despite the difficulties they were facing at that moment, they were not alone. There was a connection between them, a shared understanding that the fight for dignity and respect was ongoing. "Thank you for being here," Lydia said, her voice full of sincerity. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Derek looked at her and smiled again, a smile that conveyed solidarity and support. "I'll always be here, Lydia," he replied, "and not just for you, but for everyone who needs it, because that's the only way to make a difference." And so, as the plane continued its course through the skies, Derek and Lydia shared a moment of mutual understanding, united by their determination to fight against injustice, no matter when or where it arose. As the plane made its way toward New York, Lydia Harper remained silent, absorbing everything that had happened over the past few hours. John Parker's behavior, the racist insults, and Derek Williams' intervention weighed heavily on her mind. She knew she would need to process it all at some point. But for now, the most important thing was deciding how to react. Lydia was a woman accustomed to facing challenges, both in her personal and professional life. As a doctor, especially in underserved communities, she had witnessed and experienced the effects of prejudice and discrimination. But on this flight, things had been different. The public humiliation, John's disdainful look, and the tension it caused among the passengers made her question whether it was worth continuing to endure such things in silence. She looked at Derek, who was sitting beside her, and felt a deep gratitude for his intervention. He didn't have to get involved, but he did so courageously and decisively. It reminded her of times when others had remained silent while she endured racist attacks. Those experiences taught her to be strong, but also to keep the wounds these incidents left behind to herself. But now, something inside her was changing. Lydia felt a growing strength, a desire not to let John's venomous words define or hurt her any further. She realized that over the years, she had allowed microaggressions, disdainful glances, and implicit or explicit insults to accumulate, building a protective wall around herself. Yet Derek had shown her that strength wasn't just about enduring, but about confronting. Derek seemed to notice that Lydia was deep in thought. He leaned slightly towards her, speaking in a soft, low tone. "Are you okay, Lydia?" he asked, with a concerned look. Lydia sighed and nodded, but not entirely convinced. "Yes, I'm fine," she replied. "I'm just thinking about how I got to this point, how I let so many things affect me for so long without fighting back." Derek looked at her with understanding. "You've always fought, even if in ways you might not realize," he said. "Sometimes, just moving forward is a form of resistance." Lydia reflected on this, feeling a mix of relief and frustration. She had convinced herself that she was strong for not reacting, for not letting the words bring her down. But now, looking at John, who remained silent beside her, she knew she needed to do more than just endure. "Derek, I'm tired of just moving on," she said, her voice gaining an unexpected firmness. "I'm tired of being the person who's always strong, who always lets things slide. I can't continue like this." Derek smiled slightly, recognizing the determination emerging in Lydia. "Then maybe it's time to change that," he replied. "And you don't have to do it alone. I'm here, and there are many others who care and will stand with you." Lydia felt a warmth in her chest. She looked around the plane, noticing that many passengers were watching what was happening. Some had expressions of sympathy, others of silent support. For the first time, she felt that maybe, just maybe, she could make a difference in a way she had never tried before. She straightened up in her seat, taking a deep breath. There was something she needed to say, something that needed to be heard. "Mr. Parker," she began, turning to the man beside her, who seemed surprised to be addressed. "I want you to know that your words were painful, but they haven't destroyed me. I won't let them define who I am or what I can do." John looked at her, his expression shifting from surprise to evident discomfort. He didn't respond, but Lydia's intense gaze made it clear that she was no longer willing to be a silent victim. "You tried to belittle me, tried to humiliate me," Lydia continued, not breaking eye contact. "But what you've done has given me even more reasons to fight. And not just for me, but for everyone who suffers from attitudes like yours." The silence on the plane was absolute. Derek watched, admiring the strength emanating from Lydia at that moment. "I decide, here and now, that I will no longer accept this," Lydia declared, her voice firm and clear. "Because my dignity, my humanity, are not for sale, and I will no longer tolerate being treated as if they are." John finally broke the silence, his voice weak and hesitant. "I didn't mean to," he began, but the words failed him. Lydia interrupted him, not with anger, but with a firmness that left no doubt. "It doesn't matter what you meant or didn't mean. What matters is that you need to understand the impact of your words and actions, and that people like me won't stay silent anymore." Derek felt a wave of pride. Lydia had made a decision that would not only change how she faced racism, but also inspire others to do the same. He knew that this moment was a turning point, not just for Lydia, but for everyone who witnessed her courage. Lydia leaned back in her seat, feeling the weight of her words. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, she felt lighter, stronger. The decision to no longer accept silence as an answer had given her a new sense of power and purpose. And with that, the flight continued, carrying with it not only passengers but also a message of resistance, courage, and the importance of confronting prejudice head-on. The tension in the plane was palpable. After Lydia Harper's strong words, an uncomfortable silence settled in the cabin. The passengers, who had been watching the incident in silence, began exchanging looks, unsure of how to react. Some were still shocked by John Parker's audacity, while others admired Lydia's courage and Derek's firmness. Yet, something was changing in the air. A young woman sitting a few rows ahead, a woman in her 30s with curly hair and brown skin, looked at Lydia and Derek with a thoughtful expression. She finally stood up and turned to face John. "Excuse me, Mr. Parker," she began, her voice trembling but determined. "I'm Isabel Martinez, and I'm Latina. I've been in similar situations to Lydia's, where I was made to feel less because of my skin color or my accent. What you did was awful, and I refuse to stay silent about it." John looked at her, growing increasingly uncomfortable with the disapproving looks he was receiving from the other passengers. He opened his mouth to speak, but Isabel continued. "You have no right to treat someone this way," Isabel said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "And I won't stay quiet when I see this happening." Lydia looked at Isabel with a grateful smile, touched by the unexpected support. Derek, in turn, nodded at Isabel in acknowledgement. "Isabel is right," he said, standing up so everyone could see him. "We've all faced some form of discrimination, whether because of skin color, background, or who we are. But what happened here today goes beyond that. It's about how each of us chooses to react when we witness injustice." Another passenger, an elderly man with gray hair and fair skin, also stood up. His name was George McCarthy, a World War II veteran. "I'm old enough to have seen the world before and after the civil rights movement," he began, his voice firm. "I fought for my country, for the right of every person to be treated with dignity, no matter who they are. What you did, Parker, is an affront to everything we fought for." John, now visibly uncomfortable and unsure how to react, tried to speak again but was interrupted by a woman in the opposite row. She was a mother holding her young child. "I don't want my son to grow up in a world where it's acceptable to insult someone because of their skin color," she said, her eyes shining with determination. "I want him to learn to treat everyone with respect, and that starts with our actions here and now." The little boy, no more than 5 years old, looked at his mother and then at Lydia, still not fully understanding what was happening but sensing the gravity of the situation. He reached out his hand to Lydia, an innocent gesture but full of meaning. Lydia took the child's small hand and smiled, feeling a wave of emotion at seeing even a child recognize the importance of respect. "Thank you," Lydia said, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you all for standing with me." John, now surrounded by accusing looks, seemed to shrink in his seat. He looked around, seeing that the support he had hoped for wasn't coming. Instead, all the eyes were against him, and for the first time, he seemed to grasp the gravity of his actions. I don't know what to say," he murmured, lacking energy. Derek, noticing John's growing discomfort, moved closer to him. "It's not about what you can say right now, John," Derek said in a gentler, yet still firm tone. "It's about what you do from here on out. We all make mistakes, but what we do afterward defines who we are." John lowered his head, unable to respond. Isabel, still standing, turned to the other passengers. "We're all on this flight together," she said, "and that's more than just a metaphor. We're all part of something bigger, and we can only change the world if we act together." George nodded and placed a firm hand on Derek's shoulder. "And that's why we're with you, Lydia. All of us. It doesn't matter where we come from or what we look like. We'll face this together." Lydia, moved, looked at all the faces that, not long ago, were strangers but now were united in a gesture of solidarity and humanity. "You don't know how much this means to me," Lydia said, tears in her eyes. "Not just for me, but for all the people who go through this every day. You're showing that we can be better, that we can be the change we want to see in the world." The plane, once filled with tension, now buzzed with a sense of unity. The passengers, coming together to confront the injustice, had turned a moment of pain into an act of collective resistance. Lydia, with her hand still holding the small boy's, felt that, together, they were doing something truly meaningful. And so, in the middle of the flight to New York on a small plane, a group of passengers decided they would no longer remain silent. They united, not only for Lydia but for everyone who needed support, showing that even in a divided world, it was still possible to find strength in unity. The atmosphere inside the plane was charged with an intense and unexpected energy. John Parker, who had until then felt entitled to humiliate Lydia, now found himself cornered. The passengers' support for Lydia and Derek's firmness had made it clear that John's behavior would no longer be tolerated. He, who had always considered himself a man of influence and power, was now faced with a situation he could not control. John looked at the passengers around him, feeling increasingly cornered. Isabel's, George's, and others' words still echoed in his mind. He tried to process everything, but the mounting pressure and disapproving looks made his mind spin. He was used to being respected, to having his words accepted without question. Now, the world seemed turned upside down. He looked at Lydia next to him and saw something that deeply disturbed him: dignity. Despite all the words he had hurled at her, Lydia had not bowed down. Instead, she stood firm, with an inner strength that John could not comprehend. John began, his voice trembling and hesitant. "I don't know what to say." Lydia, who had been silent until then, looked up at him. She didn't feel anger, but a deep sadness at what she saw before her. A man who had allowed prejudice and hatred to consume him. "Maybe there's nothing to say, John," Lydia replied, her voice calm. "Sometimes silence is the best place to start listening. To listen to the voices you tried to silence, the stories you never wanted to hear." John looked away, unable to meet her gaze. He knew Lydia was right, but admitting that was something he had never done before. Admitting he was wrong was admitting weakness, and weakness was something John Parker had never accepted in himself. Derek, observing the interaction, decided to step in to open a door for John. "John, we all make mistakes," Derek said, his voice firm but not accusatory. "What matters now is how you choose to act. You can continue down this path, or you can choose to do something different, something better." John remained silent, still processing Derek's words. He looked at the other passengers, seeing the expectation in their faces. They weren't just condemning him. There was something more there, a hope that he might recognize his error and make amends. Finally, John took a deep breath, trying to find the words he was missing. I don't know how," he admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "I don't know how to change." There was a brief silence before Isabel, still standing, moved closer to him. "The first step is to recognize that you have something to learn," she said gently. "The second step is to be willing to listen. For real." John looked at Isabel, then at Lydia, and then at Derek. There was a glimmer of hope in his eyes, a small sign that maybe, just maybe, he could be better. "I want to try," he said finally, his voice filled with hesitation but also sincerity. "I don't know where to start, but I want to try." Lydia nodded, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. She knew the road to change was long and difficult, but this was a beginning. "We're all trying, John," Lydia said, "and you don't have to do it alone. But you need to be willing to face the truths that might be painful. It's the only way to grow." John nodded slowly, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. He knew there was much work ahead, both to understand the depths of his prejudice and to change. Derek placed a reassuring hand on John's shoulder. "You're not alone, John. We're all on this flight together, as Isabel said before. And that means we're all here to learn, grow, and change. The important thing is to be willing to take the next step." John looked at Derek, then at Lydia, and finally at the other passengers. There was something different in the air, a sense that, despite everything, something positive could come out of this situation. "Thank you," John said, still in a low voice. "Thank you for giving me this chance." Lydia smiled slightly. "Everyone deserves a chance, John. It's up to you what you do with it." The plane continued its journey, now with a new sense of calm. John Parker had been confronted, not just by others, but by himself. He knew that the journey ahead would be challenging, but he was willing to face it. And in the end, he recognized that this change wasn't just for him, but for everyone like Lydia who deserved to live in a world where they were treated with respect and dignity. As the plane neared its destination, everyone on board knew that this flight had become more than just a journey. It had turned into a voyage of transformation, unity, and, above all, hope. The flight from Charlotte to New York, which had started with tension and conflict, was now approaching its end. The captain announced the descent to LaGuardia Airport, and the passengers began to prepare for landing. The atmosphere on board was still charged, but there was a certain relief in the air. Lydia Harper and Derek Williams, sitting side by side, exchanged meaningful glances, aware that the incident on board could not be ignored once they disembarked. "I wish I could say that all of this will go away when we get off the plane," Lydia said, adjusting her carry-on bag. "But I know it's not that simple." Derek nodded, his expression serious. "I understand, Lydia, but what happened here can't stay just on this plane. We have to make sure there are consequences." John Parker, sitting further up, remained silent. Since the conversation with Lydia, Derek, and the other passengers, he seemed lost in thought, as if processing everything that had happened. He looked out the window, but the approaching New York landscape seemed distant and blurry. Finally, the plane touched down, and the sense of being firmly on the ground brought a wave of reality to the situation. As the plane came to a stop on the runway and passengers began to stand up to collect their carry-ons, Derek leaned toward Lydia. "Let's talk to the crew and report what happened," Derek suggested, his voice low but resolute. "I agree," Lydia responded, feeling a weight on her chest. "This can't go unpunished." As the passengers began to disembark, Derek and Lydia waited to be the last to leave. John also hesitated, realizing that something was about to happen. While they waited, Derek approached one of the flight attendants, a young blonde woman who had tried to calm the situation during the flight. "Excuse me, I'd like to report the incident that occurred during the flight," Derek said, his tone respectful but firm. "There was verbal abuse from one of the passengers, and we believe this needs to be brought to the authorities' attention." The flight attendant, already aware of the situation, nodded with a concerned look. "We've already informed the pilot about what happened, sir. Once we disembark, authorities will be waiting to speak with all of you," she said, glancing at Lydia and John, who was behind her. "Thank you," Lydia replied, trying to maintain her composure. When they finally exited the plane, a team of airport police and security personnel awaited them at the jet bridge. The head of security, a tall man with gray hair, approached. "I'm the airport security chief, Michael Thompson," he said, with a professional yet friendly voice. "We've been informed about an incident on board. I'd like you to accompany us so we can take statements and assess the situation." John Parker, who had waited in silence until this moment, looked pale and nervous. "Is this really necessary?" he asked, his voice tinged with a failed attempt at maintaining control. "Yes, sir," Michael Thompson replied firmly. "We have reports of a serious incident on board, and we need to investigate." Derek, seeing that John was on the verge of panic, decided to intervene carefully. "John, this is necessary," Derek said, in a softer tone than before. "You said you wanted to try to be better, and this is part of the process. Facing the consequences is the first step." Lydia, now standing next to Derek, merely observed, feeling a mix of emotions. She knew John needed to be held accountable, but also felt the tension of the moment. "Let's cooperate," Lydia said finally. "It's important that the authorities know what happened." The three were taken to a private room at the airport, where they were separated to give their statements. Lydia, being the direct victim, was the first to be interviewed. She detailed the incident, from the start of the insults to the moment Derek intervened. "I just want this to not happen to anyone else," Lydia said as she concluded her statement. "It's not just about me. It's about everyone who has gone through something similar." The officer taking the statement, a woman with a serious expression, nodded. "We understand, Ms. Harper. We'll do everything we can to ensure that justice is served." As Lydia spoke with the police, Derek gave his own statement, explaining how he decided to intervene and the reasons behind his actions. He also provided the recording he had made of John's insults, which could be crucial to the case. Finally, John was called to give his statement. He appeared hesitant and nervous, his hands trembling slightly as he spoke. I know I was wrong," John admitted, his voice faltering. "I don't know what came over me, But it was a mistake. I'm willing to face the consequences. The officer interviewing him observed John with a neutral expression, taking note of every word. Mr. Parker, your cooperation is essential for resolving this fairly. The recording Mr. Williams provided will be reviewed and included in the report, the officer said. Once all the statements were given, Michael Thompson returned to address Lydia, Derek, and John. We will proceed with a full investigation, and Mr. Parker may face formal charges, he explained, looking directly at John. The final decision will be made by the appropriate authorities, but I can assure you this incident will be treated with the seriousness it deserves. John simply nodded, defeated, unsure of what to say. He knew he was facing something he couldn't ignore or control with money or influence. The reality of his actions had caught up with him, and he now found himself with no way out. Lydia, feeling that a painful chapter was closing, looked at Derek, who offered her a reassuring smile. We did what was right, Derek said softly. Now, it's up to them. Yes, we did, Lydia agreed, feeling a mix of relief and exhaustion. As the formalities were completed, Lydia and Derek knew that this flight had changed not only John Parker's life but theirs as well. The incident on board had become a symbol of resistance and courage, something they could not have predicted but would now carry with them forever. Lydia Harper and Derek Williams left the airport with the sense that a battle had begun. The incident on the plane was not just a personal matter. It was a reflection of larger societal issues. Lydia, as a doctor dedicated to social causes, and Derek, a veteran and civil rights activist, knew that this was a crucial moment to make a difference. Upon arriving in New York, they each went to their respective commitments, but Lydia's mind couldn't stray far from what had happened. John Parker's name was already in the headlines, and the story was gaining traction on social media. It wasn't long before the first media inquiries started to come in. Lydia, we need to take this forward, Derek said on the phone that night. The media is already all over this, and we can use this platform to raise greater awareness. Lydia sighed, feeling the weight of responsibility. She knew that becoming the face of this story would mean exposing herself even more, but she also understood the importance of giving a voice to the fight against racism. You're right, Derek, she replied, her voice firm. We can't let this be just another story that fades away. We need to ensure there are consequences and, more importantly, changes. The next day, the two met with a civil rights lawyer, recommended by Derek. The office, located in downtown Manhattan, was a symbol of power and resistance. The lawyer, James Rivers, had a solid reputation and a track record of fighting against racial injustice. I read about what happened on the flight, James began, shaking Lydia and Derek's hands as he greeted them. I'm here to help. We can sue John Parker for verbal assault and defamation and seek damages for emotional distress. We can also work with the press to ensure this story gets widespread coverage. Lydia, still shaken by everything she had been through, thanked James for his support. I never imagined something like this would happen to me, Lydia said with a sigh. But now that it has, I want to ensure it serves a greater purpose. It's not just about me. It's about all the people who face this kind of abuse every day. Derek, sitting beside her, nodded. The fight against racism is ongoing, and every incident like this needs to be addressed with the seriousness it deserves. We can use this opportunity to take the discussion to a new level, perhaps even get legislative support to strengthen penalties for hate crimes. James smiled, recognizing the determination in both of them. You're absolutely right. This is a moment for real change. I'll prepare the documents for the lawsuit, and I'll also reach out to some reliable journalists to ensure the story is told correctly. With everything in motion, Lydia and Derek began to grasp the magnitude of the situation. In the following days, Lydia was contacted by various media outlets, and soon her story was on all the major news channels. Derek, always by her side, became an active voice in the fight for justice, participating in interviews and debates, where he spoke about the importance of confronting racism directly and publicly. We can't allow racism to hide behind closed doors or be ignored any longer, Derek said in a live interview. What happened to Lydia is just one example of how prejudice and hatred still permeate our society. We're here to make sure that changes. The story gained international attention, and soon John Parker's name became synonymous with intolerance. Companies began distancing themselves from him, and contracts were canceled. John, who had always taken pride in his position of power, was now being publicly condemned. Lydia, in turn, started receiving messages of support from people around the world. Many shared their own experiences with racism, and she realized her voice had become a source of inspiration for those needing strength to face their own challenges. One afternoon, while Lydia was at her apartment, her phone rang. It was John Parker. She hesitated before answering, but finally decided to hear what he had to say. "Lydia, John's voice was trembling. "I know I can't undo what I did, but I want to apologize, genuinely. I don't know what made me act that way, but I know it was wrong. I'm willing to face the consequences, whatever the verdict." Lydia listened in silence, feeling a mix of emotions. Part of her wanted to forgive, but another part knew that forgiveness wouldn't change what had happened. "John, it's not me you need to apologize to," Lydia finally responded. "It's to all the people you've harmed with your actions, with your prejudice. Apologizing is a start, but it's not enough. You need to do more than that. You need to change." John remained silent on the other end of the line, but Lydia could hear his heavy breathing. "I'll try, Lydia. I promise I'll try," he said, with a tone that seemed sincere. Lydia hung up the phone with a sense of relief, but also of continuity. She knew that the fight was just beginning, and that for real change to happen, it would take more than a simple apology. It would require a deep transformation, both in John and in society. As she looked out the window of her New York apartment, Lydia felt a new determination growing within her. She knew the fight wouldn't be easy, but she was ready to face it, alongside Derek and all those who believed in a better future where justice and equality prevailed. The following month brought significant changes for everyone involved in the flight incident. Lydia Harper and Derek Williams became symbols of resistance against racism, while John Parker faced the consequences of his actions. The case gained media notoriety and sparked broader discussions about racism and justice. Lydia, now with a packed schedule of commitments and interviews, struggled to balance her personal and professional life. Despite the media frenzy, she continued working as a doctor and engaging in her philanthropic activities. Her office was constantly filled with journalists and reporters seeking a statement or an update on the case. One afternoon, Lydia was at her clinic when she received an unexpected phone call from James Rivers, her lawyer. "Lydia, do you have a minute?" James asked, his tone serious. "Sure, James. What's up?" Lydia replied, feeling a chill in her stomach. "John Parker's trial is approaching, and there are some important updates," James said. "I wanted to let you know that the impact of your story is much greater than we anticipated. You've become a powerful voice for those facing discrimination." Lydia smiled, though with a touch of concern. "I just want this to bring about real change," she said. "What else do we need to know?" "Well, John is facing a series of consequences. His company is being sued for his conduct, and several major contracts have been canceled. He's being pressured to make a public apology and participate in sensitivity training on racism," James explained. Lydia sighed, feeling a mix of satisfaction and exhaustion. "And what about the impact on the trial?" she asked. "How is this affecting the case?" "The media is covering the case extensively, and the court is handling it with the seriousness it deserves. However, we still need to ensure that the system delivers justice properly and effectively. We'll need your continued involvement and support," James replied. Lydia agreed, determined to move forward. "I'll be there. We can't let this be just a fleeting headline. It's important that this leads to real change." Meanwhile, John Parker was grappling with the reality of his actions. His lawyers tried to negotiate a settlement, but the public pressure was immense. He decided to make a public statement, hoping it might mitigate some of the repercussions he was facing. John, at a press conference organized by his lawyers, appeared visibly nervous. He addressed the reporters with a look of regret. "I want to start by apologizing to Lydia Harper and everyone affected by my words and actions," John said, his voice trembling. "What I did was unacceptable, and I am deeply sorry. I am committed to participating in sensitivity and re-education programs on racism, and I will do my best to make amends." Reporters fired questions at him, but John remained steadfast in his message of apology. Lydia watched the statement on television in her clinic, feeling a sense of accomplishment mixed with skepticism. Later, Lydia and Derek met at a cafe to discuss the next steps. Derek was excited about the news, but also skeptical about the true impact of John's actions. John's statement was a good start, but will it really lead to change? Derek asked, stirring his coffee. It's a step at least, Lydia replied. He's facing the consequences, and that's important. But the most crucial thing is that the system continues to address these cases with seriousness and that others learn from this. I agree, Derek said, nodding. And it's also essential that we continue to support and empower those facing discrimination. Our fight can't stop here. Lydia smiled, grateful for Derek's ongoing support. We'll keep working to make a difference. And we need to ensure that our story doesn't become just another isolated example. Derek nodded, satisfied with Lydia's determination. Absolutely. And we'll use our platform to create real and lasting change. As they spoke, Lydia received a message from a civil rights organization inviting her to speak at an event about racism and justice. She accepted the invitation with enthusiasm, feeling that her and Derek's voices could make an even greater impact. That night, John Parker retreated to his home, exhausted and reflecting on what he had lost. His public image was damaged, and he knew that recovery would be difficult. However, he also felt a slight hope that by facing his mistakes and seeking redemption, he might find a path to personal transformation. Meanwhile, Lydia and Derek prepared for the next step in their journey, aware that they had made significant progress but that the fight for justice and equality was far from over. They would continue to work to ensure that Lydia's story not only inspired but also contributed to meaningful and lasting change in society. Spring had arrived in New York, bringing a milder climate and a renewed sense of hope. Lydia Harper was preparing for a significant event, a recognition ceremony for her work and resilience in fighting racism. She had been invited to receive an award from a civil rights organization, and the ceremony would be held in an elegant venue in downtown. On the morning of the event, Lydia and Derek were backstage, talking and preparing for what promised to be a moment of great significance. Lydia, are you ready for this? Derek asked, with an encouraging smile. You've done an amazing job and earned every bit of this recognition. Lydia smiled, though a bit nervous. I'm excited but also a little anxious. It's not just about the award, but what it represents. I hope we can use this platform to inspire others to fight against racism. We definitely will, Derek replied, nodding. And remember, change doesn't happen all at once. Every step, every story shared, counts. The event began with an opening speech by one of the leaders of the civil rights organization. The hall was filled with supporters, activists, and people interested in promoting social change. Lydia, dressed in an elegant dark blue gown, felt a mix of nerves and gratitude as she took the stage. When it was her turn to speak, Lydia took a deep breath and approached the microphone. The audience was attentive, and the stage lights illuminated her face, highlighting the determination in her eyes. Good evening, everyone, Lydia began, with a firm voice. I want to start by thanking the organization for this recognition. However, I'd like to take this opportunity to remind us all that the fight against racism is an ongoing battle. What happened to me on that flight was a painful reminder that prejudice is still present in our society. But it is also an opportunity for us to do something about it. The audience listened in silence, many nodding in agreement. Lydia continued, emphasizing the importance of confronting racism and working toward equality. It's essential that we, as a society, stand up against injustice, not just when we are directly affected, but whenever we witness something wrong. We need to ensure that our children and grandchildren live in a world where everyone is treated with respect and dignity, regardless of skin color. After her speech, Lydia received the award and left the stage to warm applause from the audience. Derek was by her side, giving her an encouraging hug. You were fantastic, Lydia, Derek said. Your speech was inspiring and touched many hearts. Thank you, Derek, Lydia replied with a tired smile. And thank you for always being by my side. Without your support, I couldn't have faced all of this. As the ceremony continued, Lydia had the opportunity to talk with various activists and community leaders. She shared experiences and heard inspiring stories from others fighting against injustice. The evening was a celebration not only of her achievements, but also of the collective victories in the civil rights struggle. Later, At the end of the event, Lydia and Derek walked through the illuminated city. The atmosphere was filled with positive energy, and Lydia felt a sense of accomplishment. "Look, Lydia," Derek said, pointing to the horizon. "The city looks different today, don't you think?" "Yes, it seems more promising," Lydia replied. "It's like we're starting a new chapter, with more hope and a renewed commitment to justice." Derek smiled, agreeing. "Exactly. And despite the difficulties and challenges we'll still face, we know we're making a difference. That's what really matters." As they walked through the streets, Lydia reflected on the impact of what had happened. John Parker had faced the consequences of his actions and was seeking personal change. But Lydia knew that the most significant transformation came from ongoing work and a commitment to promoting equality. As the night progressed, Lydia and Derek arrived at Lydia's apartment. She was preparing to rest, but before going to bed, she received a message from John Parker. The message was a request for a meeting to discuss how he could collaborate on social justice initiatives and anti-racism education. Lydia read the message with a mix of skepticism and hope. She knew that real change came not just from words, but from concrete actions and a genuine commitment to transformation. "Derek, look at this," Lydia said, showing the message to Derek. "John is asking to meet and discuss how he can contribute." Derek examined the message and looked at Lydia. "It's a sign that he's trying to do the right thing," he said. "And if he's truly committed, maybe we can find a way to work together to promote meaningful change." Lydia agreed, determined to assess John's sincerity. She knew that the path to reconciliation and personal transformation was long and complex, but she was willing to take a step forward, believing it could be the start of something positive. As she turned off the light and prepared for bed, Lydia felt a deep sense of accomplishment and hope. She knew that the fight for justice and equality was far from over, but she also felt that each step taken was a move toward a more just future. And so, with renewed determination and an optimistic outlook, Lydia Harper and Derek Williams prepared to continue their journey, inspiring change and contributing to a society where everyone was treated with dignity and respect.